Hello, everyone, and welcome to AMRC's next webinar of the Network Advantage. Today, we're going to talk to you about our latest white paper and research that we published back in October, and then the subsequent consultation that we are consulting on the topic of quality and how we measure quality. The reason why we've decided to do a consultation on this important topic is how do we know if we're incrementally getting better or improving if we don't know how to define quality in the first place? So that's the sort of the base question that is going to give you the main context or ignite why we're talking about this today. Also very proud to be joined by Jim Kremidas, who many of you will have already known and seen before in our webinars. But today you also get to see myself and Emma, who are part of the operations behind AMRC. I know we're not always at the forefront of these things, so hopefully you get to enjoy hearing from us today. So a little bit of scene setting, just to sort of colour in what we're going to talk about. When we launched AMRC, which was only in January this year, so less than 12 months ago, our main mission was to advocate on behalf of MCRC, so multi-site clinical research corporations, and really look at advocating for their model, their business model, and also the benefits of working with these site types, of which we know there are myriad site types, including different types of site networks that exist in our landscape today. We felt that there sort of existed these disparate data sets and pieces of research done by a multitude of different academic sites, or I should say academic outfits, research institutes, commercial-led companies, but we didn't feel like it had kind of really all been brought together by one organization to really understand what is the understanding of the MCRC model and what are the perceptions of the model. So that really formed the basis, or really drove why we wanted to both create and publish a white paper. The white paper consists of three different elements. Firstly, desk research on existing data. Secondly, we partnered with SBM Research to sort of create proprietary research on key topics, key questions that we really wanted to understand the answer to. And we actually worked in combination with Clinical Leader to send out this survey to their database of sponsors, CROs, other clinical trial industry stakeholders to get their views on where they saw things today. And then thirdly, we also surveyed our own membership. We currently have 18 MCRCs as AMRC members. A lot of acronyms to throw at people. So a combination of all those 3 points created what you will have seen in the white paper today. So without further ado, we wanted to give you sort of a key takeaway of what are the 5 things you must know about what is in our white paper. What does this research glean? And I think it's safe to say that this was pretty much Emma's baby when it came to pulling this information together and really spearheading some of the methodology behind certainly some of the proprietary research. So it makes sense to do a little bit of a Q&A with Emma on what are the 5 key things that people need to know about this research. So I'm going to throw over to you. What is the first thing we need to know about this white paper?
Ooh. I know you're testing me. It was October when we did it. So I think yes, you mentioned obviously that we summarised a number of research that was already in market. And what we did notice through the course of doing that was that perceptions of MCRC have been changing, as you would expect. So one that I will point out is a 2024 investigation by Linking Leaders, which was probably the most recent before we then did our survey with SBM Research looking at perceptions. So at the time, so 2024, Linking Leaders found that the model was well understood within the industry. But that's
the MCRC model is well understood.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. But they highlighted a hesitancy to engage with these networks, particularly among smaller organisations. And at the time, the perception seemed to be that consolidation had added to operational complexity and increased costs.
Okay, so they're fully aware of what the MCRC model is, but they feel that maybe there's a hesitancy to use them because they think it's a more expensive model to use. Is that a fair sort of summary of what that linking leaders research said?
That was certainly the case for that investigation in 2024. So that then sort of took us into where we are today. So and we surveyed sponsors and CROs who about sort of what their perception of MCRCs are. Now, we found that 77% of sponsors and CROs had direct experience engaging with site networks. So the MCRC model is very well understood and it is widely used. But the kind of the key point for us, or a really interesting learning, was that it's not necessarily perceived as being the highest quality model. So while those that had worked with MCRCs noted a number of strengths, SOP-driven operation, centralization, strong document management, when we asked them to rate different models, MCRC's got an average of 3.7 out of 5, which means that they were classed as kind of good by these guys, but they weren't classed as excellent. And there were other models that they did class as excellent, most notably the academic medical institutes. So, and actually, to be fair, when we did a LinkedIn poll very recently where we asked our followers what they thought was the biggest misconception of the model from sort of sponsors and CROs, and they cited PE-backed, PE backing decreasing quality. So
this was on our LinkedIn, wasn't it, when we did a
it was,
poll?
yeah. So I think it was probably indicative of a misnomer there that's sort of persisting. So even while we can demonstrate quality across sort of very obvious quality measures, it doesn't really translate when you ask people sort of broadly speaking, is this good, bad, or ugly? They're, well, it's good, it's not excellent.
Okay, so just to take us back slightly, so I guess first highlight is sponsors and CROs know what the MC model is, but there's a hesitance to use them because they think that they're more expensive. And then I guess the second insight we're getting here is that is backed up by our own proprietary research that says, yes, we are rated, or the MCRC model is rated highly on all of these so-called quality measures like standing operating procedures and what else is there that they were including? Oh, centralization and document management, correct. But that these elements are not perceived as quality markers. Is that what we're kind of getting from this?
So what we asked them is, do you see kind of overall how would you rate this model out of 5? And the majority of them said sort of 3.7, which puts it in a good, good, it's solid, but it's not kind of up there in that excellent bucket.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a quick comment that I could add is it's interesting that when you look at quantitatively, all those parameters would indicate, like you said, high quality, but yet the overall perception is maybe not. And, you have to wonder if some of that has to do with the fact that MCRCs are an evolving area within this clinical research space. And typically our industry is somewhat risk adverse. And you wonder if perhaps that's the concern. It's more of, do I want to take the risk because maybe the quality is not as good, even though on those separate parameters they rate them well. And I think that's an interesting type. It's an interesting approach to how I'll call them customers, because we're talking CROs and sponsors, tend to operate. There are other things that have happened in this industry in the past, like the uptake of EDC. A lot of the things around patient recruitment back in the day, where once we first introduced these new ideas, people were very hesitant and they came up with a lot of different reasons why they didn't want to go down that path. And I just wonder to some extent whether or not that's the case here.
That's a really good point, because I think and this applies to any sector, not just clinical trials or clinical research, but I think there's a difference in what people say versus what they do. And we've seen, with the LinkedIn poll, for example, where we asked, does centralization and standardization of certain processes and procedures lead to either better quality, efficiency, both, or neither? And it came out that it led to both. Yet, according to what we're seeing in this research and what you've just described, Jim, as experience from being in the field, is saying something else. And maybe it is that risk aversion that that's been exercised here. Okay, great. So Emma, what's point number 3 that we need to take away from this research?
So you alluded there to some research that we did with our members, and that is one of the advantages we have as AMRC, is that we can collate anonymous data from all of our members, which kind of gives us insight into what's happening at an industry level. And we did some work with our members looking at PI, so principal investigators and CRC, clinical research coordinators, the kind of average tenure within the business and turnover there. And we found that across the AMRC network, PI turnover was just sort of 7.8%, which compares to an industry average of 54.2. Now, that's not a direct comparison because, well, so Duke and FDA, it's a Duke and an FDA stat from 2017. Right. And this is a problem that we hit up on again and again, is that there just isn't a huge amount of data out in the world sort of talking about this kind of thing. And that's obviously a gap.
That's quite interesting, though, particularly when I'm sure a lot of people watching this will be very aware of the one and done problem. Yeah. And this directly speaks to how, the MCRC model is actually mitigating that problem, and quite significantly, even though we know that the data sets are difficult to compare, but they give some indicator or some signal that the MCRC model is actually improving that situation.
But it makes sense that it would, right? Because you have a network of sites that all have PIs that have varying experiences and backgrounds. You kind of already plugged into a support system that you just wouldn't get with it.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, and also that's their sole focus. A lot of investigator sites are also running a clinical practice. So you have the pressures of that clinical practice in addition to trying to conduct clinical research. And they're two different business models. It makes it very stressful. The fact that these people are professional and focused on just delivering clinical research results, I think is another reason why we have less turnover.
I think so, yeah. And sorry, go on, Emma. Too much to say.
No, I was going to say it plays out as well, not just PIs. So CRCs have within the AMRC network have a turnover rate of sort of 15.4%, which is versus 33% industry average, which is an ACRP figure from 2023. So it's a little bit more robust than that Duke and FDA one.
That's incredible. So, and in fact, that actually is in line with some of the polls we've been doing on LinkedIn, which is when we've asked people what is a when you're looking at site selection, what's one of the biggest predictors of success, and actually local PI engagement was one of the most cited elements of that. So that's good to know that MCRCs are doing well in this arena. Okay, number 4.
So the market recognizes the strengths, and we touched on this before, but hasn't sort of linked them to quality. So a separate question that we asked with SBM and in part of that project was we asked respondents to rank different models across 23 metrics, and they selected MCRCs as best in class 26% of the time. So this is the same group that said when we ask you sort of how good you are, sort of around about 3.7, 26% of the time MCRCs were selected as best in class, and that's second only to the academic or medical centres who were 29%. So it's really comparable.
Not that much less, yeah.
And MCRCs were recognised by this group as being particularly associated with things like consistency, faster startup time, scalable infrastructure, and access to diverse patient populations, which are arguably all some of the most important factors in site selection. But when we asked the same respondents what models performed best, around a quarter of them didn't know or had no preference. So you can say, like, objectively everything's working quite well, you're best in class on a number of these things, but which do you prefer? Oh, well, we're not really sure, or we don't want to commit, or it's I think, to my mind, it speaks to an opportunity there to sort of translate those operational strengths into more of a quality narrative, and that's kind of what we're missing. Drawing the dots for people there.
Do you have any insight onto that, Jim, as to why people are citing us as excellent, but MCRCs as excellent, but then when it comes to model preference type, they can't choose anyone?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting. The things that they rated MCRCs the highest on tended to be very operational kinds of things, like faster enrollment, like you were saying earlier, Emma, and things of that nature, things you can measure. But there may be something behind that that has to do with depending on the study. And the reason I say that is, typically when you think of oncology studies, you often go to academic institutions because that's where the patients are. That being said, a lot of our members do oncology studies and are embedded and work closely with hospitals, but the industry may not be aware of that at this point. So it may be that they're thinking about, well, it depends on what kind of trial we're talking about, which type of site organization or site structure I would most favor. That's the only thing I can come up with.
Okay, that's still helpful to understand. Also, just want to remind anyone watching that if you do have questions, please send them through because there will be time at the end to go through these. You can see some were already coming through, but just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. Okay, so before we move on to the last one, I just wanted to recap on what the first 4 points were. So people understand the MCR model, but are perceiving them as maybe a little bit more expensive, which is why there might be a hesitancy to use them. Secondly, MCRCs are widely understood, but they're not perceived as the highest quality model. Maybe they're just good, but they're not excellent. The third one is that MCRCs outperform the industry average or the data we have on industry average when it comes to workforce stability, particularly when we're talking about principal investigators and clinical research conductors. And then fourth, the strengths of the MCRC model are recognized, but they're not necessarily linked back to the perception of quality. So number 5, what is the last thing that people need to take away from this research, Anne?
Well, I think sort of summarizing in all of those points, it's really key kind of going forward now that we start to build strategic relationships with sponsors and CROs. So industry partners are recognizing the strengths and the operational strengths of the MCRC model, but they're not equating them with quality markers. So we kind of need to shift those relationships a little bit from tactical engagement to more sort of strategic partnership, where we can do where we can sort of have sort of a shared governance, pipeline visibility, continuous feedback loops, and really make the most of the operational strengths of the MCRC model.
That's interesting because Jim, we did a sort of a roundtable deep dive with a group of sponsors and CROs at the ING event in September earlier this year to discuss exactly that. How do we move relationships or between sites, sponsors and CROs from a tactical one to more of a strategic one? Is there anything that you can sort of, without giving too much of the game away, because I know you've got an opinion article coming out on that soon, actually, but is there anything you kind of want to highlight in that why maybe we haven't moved to these strategic partnerships yet and we're still stuck in that sort of tactical based approach?
Yeah, the industry talks a lot about being the preferred sponsor or the preferred CRO and things of that nature. But a true strategic partnership goes beyond that. It's you're sharing information and trusting one another and developing processes, developing protocols, developing things that benefit both parties. And I don't think we're there yet. There's a lot of transactional. Most of the relationships these days are very transactional. And again, some are moving towards a little tighter relationship, but we haven't really hit a strategic partnership yet, where things that are happening like the portfolio of studies that are coming up over the next, say, 5 years are being shared with MCRCs by sponsors. That would be really interesting. If you're a large sponsor and you had 3 or 4 therapeutic areas where you're going to be doing a lot of studies and you could partner with 3 or 4 of our members, you could really accelerate things. And on the side of our membership, they could plan for when that is coming to their into their pipeline. So they can plan their staffing better. They can plan other things better. They can give you preferential treatment. There's a lot of different things that we really haven't explored in terms of the relationships between sponsors and sites. And the interesting thing about MCRCs is they have the infrastructure to support that type of relationship. It would be much more difficult for individual sites or even academic sites to some extent. So I think that's where the industry is going in the future, but it's going to take us a while to get there. Something as simple as letting the corporation, the MCRC, tell the sponsor, these are the sites you should use because they know their sites, as opposed to today where sponsors go, oh, I want to pick one site from this company and two sites from that company. And it's backwards today in terms of how sponsors are working with MCRCs. Sorry, Katie.
Yeah, I wonder if there's ever been these enterprises or these corporations that are, capable of facilitating what a portfolio of studies might look like for a sponsor or a CRO, and actually being able to execute on that work and take a long-term view as a partner with those companies.
Yeah.
And B, I guess it also depends on having the trust and the openness to communicate in that way, to have, and maybe that is a way to instill that is by having shared outcomes, because how do I know that the site network is being truthful in saying that, yes, this number of sites can deliver you X number of patients? How do I know that those feasibility numbers are going to be accurate?
Yeah, measure it. That's what needs to be done. The other thing, though, is it's interesting. One of the biggest complaints that we get from sites is when sponsors have a study and they ask the site to get up and ready to go, and then they delay it and they don't tell the site. They're delaying it for 6 months, and then they come back at the last minute and say, oh, we're not starting when we thought we were going to start, or we're not going to do this study at all. That's really difficult on a business when they're planning their resources against that work. It really makes it tricky. Now, on the positive side is because MCRCs have such a broad portfolio of customers, they can adapt probably more easily in terms of how they use their resources than an individual site could. But nevertheless, it's really difficult it makes it difficult for them to run their businesses. So these are the kinds of communications that would help both parties if we were having them.
Totally. Which I guess brings us on into a nice segue. It's almost as if we planned it, to talk about our consultation on quality. Because much of what we just discussed with each of those 5 insights that we got from the white paper is kind of all leading to this question of how do we define quality, and why should we define it, and who do we want to help us define it as well. So I think, Jim, it would be good, because we've got sort of 4 key areas that we're asking open-ended questions on, that we want people to write back to us with their answers. Should we go through each section and just explain sort of what we're looking for, or why we're asking the questions we are in each of those sections?
Sure. Katie, let me give you a little prelude, though. One of the reasons we're doing this is everybody in the industry knows that we measure, as an industry, speed. Right? Speed of enrollment, speed of getting the site up and running, the speed of closing out the site, et cetera. That's a good thing. And the metrics exist for that. And they started working on that years ago across the industry with a company called CRM that developed these or helped the industry collaborate on how to define those particular stages of a study. We also measure costs. Now, ironically, I want to go back to this thing about being more expensive. That's so wrong, but in terms of how people interpret it, because the reality is every day you save on a clinical study, you're saving $40,000 in expenses on average. So even if you are paying a little bit more to an MCRC, if they're faster, they're cheaper. Okay, but I'll save that for later, because we're going to talk about quality. So we're talking about speed, value, or cost, and then quality. Well, quality is the one that is the most subjective, in that it's really more perception more than anything else. Are there quantitative ways of measuring it? Perhaps, as leading indicators, things like number of queries, time to query resolution, serious queries versus just less serious queries, or protocol deviations, I should say, serious protocol deviations. So we want to measure we want to learn how can we define quality across the industry, and that not just for MCRCs, but for all sites. And what are the things that allow us to measure that? So how do we define it? How do we measure it? That doesn't exist today. It's very much perception. So with that, I'll go ahead and let's dive in.
So the first section is on defining quality. So talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, like I was saying, the it's interesting the data that we have collected that basically says if you look at these quantitative types of things that define quality, we're doing pretty well. But for some reason, the industry does not see MCRCs as providing quality work. So, what exactly do you mean by that? And that's the question we're asking. Okay, we hear you. You don't think the quality is as good, but what does that really mean? How do you define quality? Now, I think we're probably going to get some people, I don't want to lead the witnesses, okay, but some of the people are going to come back and say, well, it's the quality of the data. It might be the quality of the communication or working with the site. There's a lot of different ways people can define that. How well did they treat the patients? Was the retention
Yeah,
good?
patient outcomes.
Yeah, things of that nature. So this is great. Let us know what you think. And then hopefully we can then start putting some parameters around, okay, so how do we measure that? Maybe it's surveys. Maybe it's surveys after the study's completed with patients. Maybe there's something we can measure from a timing perspective or, again, protocol deviations or something like that. I don't know. But I think it's an important question that the industry has yet to answer.
Yeah, I think for that one, we're quite happy for everyone to throw the kitchen sink in there and give us an array of ideas as to, what they have seen has worked well. And in fact, I think more examples of what has worked in the past versus what would be a nice to have is definitely a great indication because we know that that's what people do already, as opposed to what we think they might want. So just wanted to add that in there.
Sorry, Kate, to
yeah,
jump
go on,
in. Well, around sort of defining quality. So if there's anything that for you within your sector of the industry that you think is synonymous with quality, it might be very different in other models and other areas of the industry. But that's, again, really important insight for us as part of this exercise, is to understand how different parts of the industry are viewing quality as well.
Yeah, great point. Next section is around people and professionalism. Jim, do you want to talk to us a little bit more on that?
Sure. One of the interesting challenges in this industry is we have a lack of, well, we don't have as large a workforce as we need. We also do not have standardized training or, and I used to say this all the time at ACRP, certification. This is the only industry in healthcare that does not require some form of licensure or certification. So the question becomes, how important is that to you? And should we do something like that? What defines a professional clinical researcher? I mean, literally anybody can get into it. Yeah, if you look at the FDA guidelines around the personnel conducting trials, it just simply says the sponsor needs to make sure that the people they hired do this are qualified. What does that mean? We don't have a definition around that. So, I mean, generally people interpret it to say, well, the PI is the primary, principal investigator. They're the ones responsible. They 99% of the time have some type of a medical degree, or at a minimum, a PhD in some other field, perhaps. But generally, they're physicians that specialize in that particular area. But that being said, what about the coordinators? What about the data managers? There's a lot of different areas in this industry that really should require, I think, some type of I'll say certification.
Yeah, and I think, oh gosh, this is going to bring me way back, but I actually did my master's dissertation on whether it was actually the public relations industry at the time should be classed as a profession. And I looked at, okay, so what makes a profession a profession? And if you look at the traditional professions like medicine, like law, you need a certain amount of qualification in there. But that doesn't mean to say, and there might be good reason why you don't want to put those parameters in place because then it locks certain people out. However, that doesn't mean to say that you can't be professional or have criteria for professionalism that people can strive towards that then helps the whole industry then pulls its socks up. And I think there's been some great stuff that we've seen coming out of ACRP in this space. And
yes.
It would be wonderful to actually maybe partner with them on something like this. So if anyone from ACRP is watching, please do feedback to the consultation because it'd be great to have your voice in there too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Third section, data maturity and technology. Jim, take it away.
Well, obviously, the purpose of a clinical trial is to collect and gather the data and, of course, analyze the data that is then used for submission, either for product approval or for some type of a publication. But the point is, the outcome is all about the data and what we learn from that as a medical industry. So that's one of the things I mentioned earlier. Like, is data what you define as quality, the quality of the data, or does it go beyond that? But in this circumstance, there are now new technology tools. Are there technology tools that perhaps we should be looking at from again, I'll call it certification, but some type of a standardization? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I know there's a lot of work going on in that area with some organizations, but technology is important, and how the data is captured and how clean is the data, I think is probably going to be one of the things that comes to the forefront when we start defining quality.
Yeah, I think the topic around technology for me personally raises two issues. Firstly, how does this sector intersect with frontier technology? So how is the industry using AI or thinking about using AI, or maybe even like blockchain technology for the purposes of data provenance and recording? But then secondly, I think also there's something to be said here around, for the first time, we've got site organizations that are getting to a critical mass or to a size and scale by which they can actually create their own technologies. I think before, a lot of site technology has been created for them by other organizations, like sponsors, like CROs, like other tech providers. But I think actually now MCRCs are perhaps in a position where they're actually able to start dictating what some of those technologies should look like and what the design of that should be and the purpose. So I'm really interested to see the thoughts and ideas that people might have on that.
Yeah.
And then sorry, Jim, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to move on to the last section if you're ready.
I'm ready.
So patient recruitment and outcomes. Let's go for it.
Oh, this is one of my soft spots in terms of where we need improvement in the industry. Patient recruitment has been an issue for decades, and it continues to be an issue for a wide variety of reasons. But it's kind of what I was saying earlier. Like, how does quality tie into that? Patient recruitment is generally thought of more as a speed type of a parameter, if you will. But one of the things that worries me a little bit about technology is, do we lose the human touch? People who are coming into clinical trials, obviously, well, not always, but generally speaking, have a healthcare problem, right? So they're dealing with something that can be very, very emotional, especially if it's a very life-threatening disease. And so the question becomes, how do we keep that human touch, and how do you define that from a quality perspective as we're working with people that we would like to have participate in our trials? They're volunteering for all practical purposes, right? And so they're giving up their time. They're taking a chance in some circumstances, in a lot of circumstances. And they're trying to provide something to the industry and to mankind, if you will, to healthcare, to be able to use their data in order to help us make better medical decisions in the future. So that piece of how we bring them in and how we maintain that relationship with them throughout a trial, I think is really, really important. Again, from a quality perspective, because it's almost like a customer service type of thing. I have to tell you a quick anecdote. My wife and I took my grandson to McDonald's the other day, thinking we'd go in there, get a Happy Meal, we'd be out of there in 5 minutes. We were there for 45 minutes. And there were all kinds of people coming. Something was going wrong, but people were coming in and out screaming because they were sitting in the parking lot. They went through the drive-through. It was a disaster. I've never seen a McDonald's like this in my life. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It was horrible customer service, and we'll never go back to that McDonald's. So we need to make sure that people that are taking their time and volunteering and participating in trials and taking some risk with their healthcare are treated with respect and with dignity and with given really top-notch customer service. So I think that, again, is another quality parameter. The humanistic touch is really important.
Well, actually, if you think about it, patient retention in the life cycle of a study, plus also whether they come back and do further studies, is, I would say, a clear indicator of good quality for that site or that corporation. More importantly, though, did you get the Happy Meal?
Eventually, yes.
Thank
And
gosh.
but they forgot his apple juice.
Oh no,
I
sure.
had to go back to get the apple juice. So, sorry, everybody. Oh God, it was funny.
So, funnily enough, there are no questions about that coming
Yeah.
through at the moment, but we are here to answer any of your questions. Let's start with the first one, actually. Oh, wait, no, actually, before we move on to that, sorry. Who should respond to this, Jim, to this consultation?
Oh, I think anybody who's in our industry. I'm hoping we get primarily sponsors and CROs because that's to my mind the big question, how they perceive, the quality question. Because once we know what they're thinking, that will allow not just MCRC sites and AMRC sites,
Any
but
site.
all sites to respond to this is the thing I need to be able to do most effectively, or the things I need to be able to do effectively in order to prove that I'm a quality outfit. Just, hey, Katie, one other thing I wanted to throw out. If you look at other industries, you've got things like Six Sigma that help drive quality. You've got ISO certifications. There are different types of certifications and validations that show that an organization is high quality, and they use this a lot in manufacturing and other areas. Now, granted, this is a service industry, not a manufacturing industry, but nevertheless, there are still things you can put in place that are good, strong indicators of what quality really means.
And actually, to use that analogy, in financial services, they use IOSCO principles, and that is a service-based industry. So
Great
it's
point.
very similar.
Yeah, great point.
How do people respond
I'm sorry?
to the consultation? How do people respond to the consultation?
Oh, well, they can go ahead, Emma.
Go on,
That's a
Emma.
relatively easy one.
Is that why you're answering this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm jumping in now because then I've banked it and I don't have to do it again. You'll find on the AMRC website we have an industry consultation tab at the top there, and if you go on the website, that if you go on that landing page, you'll be able to download the consultation, which is a series of open-ended questions. And I think as Katie and Jim have reinforced, what we're hoping for here is a bit of insight from everybody on quality metrics, so that we can create an effective and a relevant standard, or so that we can start working towards creating an effective and a relevant standard. And that is really the point of a consultation. And you can share that with us when you've completed it. So the deadline is December the 3rd, 5 p.m. ET. And if you could submit that in a Word or PDF document via email to info@amrc.org, that would be fantastic.
Saying thank you. Guys, what are we going to do with the responses once we are flooded with people wanting to respond to this?
I think that's going to be my job, isn't it? So we'll be collating and analysing the feedback. We will publish a summary of anonymous responses, so that everybody who's taken part and even those who haven't taken part can kind of get a bit of a look behind the curtain and see what people are thinking. That insight, though, will be used to instruct the 2026 AMRC strategy, and it will form kind of a key point of any standards that we continue to advocate for as an organisation going forward.
Yeah, and I think it also gives us the opportunity to possibly identify work streams where we can team up with other organizations, whether that's other trade organizations, perhaps academic institutes, or other, even like service providers in the industry, perhaps, on some of the elements that are identified in this. So yeah, so it will be used responsibly. Can't even say that word. That's good. Okay, I think we've got a few more minutes just to do quick questions, Q&A that we've got coming through. If anyone else would like to send through a last minute question, there is still time. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these. Okay, so we've just talked about that we want everyone to respond to this who's interested or is a stakeholder in the clinical trials industry, but why would non-AMRC members respond to this consultation?
You're talking about sites? Why would none?
or any sites, or well, yeah, just any non-AMRC member. Let's start with sites. Why would other sites who maybe aren't members of AMRC contribute to this?
Well, I think it's because they will benefit from the results as well. And quite frankly, we're very interested in their opinions. Like I said earlier, anybody who's involved in this industry has a perception of quality, whether they are constantly thinking about it or not. They're concerned about quality because the quality of the work that's done is what leads to new therapies. So, and everybody will be able to use this. So I would say the more the merrier. I hope that made sense.
It does. I guess it's a case of, a rising tide raises all ships.
Perfect.
It means we can all contribute to moving this industry forward in a responsible way that makes sense, that hears from all site types and not just, a chosen few. I guess that's kind of answered this second question, which is how does this consultation benefit the industry at large and not just AMRC members? Maybe we can talk a little bit more about how it benefits sponsors and CROs.
Well, from my perspective, Emma, please jump in. It'll help them do a better job of selecting sites that are going to perform better. Emma, your thoughts?
Absolutely. And if we can have some sort of defined quality standard, then you can compare those site types as well much more easily.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. This, I guess, is a little bit adjacent to what we're discussing today, but are we looking to add any more members to AMRC? Jim, I'll let you answer that one.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I guess the bottom line is yes, but it's not really a primary focus of ours. The way we're approaching this as a trade association is we're trying to raise, like you said, Katie, rising tides raise all ships, for any organization that fits our criteria. In other words, what we do should benefit not only our members, but for other companies that are similar to our members, whether they're a member or not. So yeah, we would like to have the more the merrier, because I think the more that we work together and collaborate as an industry, the louder our voice will be. But on the other hand, we don't necessarily want to let in organizations that are not performing well or don't provide good quality. Another good reason for us to understand what the quality means, because we feel very strongly that the organizations that are part of AMRC represent this concept or this philosophy of providing really good quality clinical research services at the site level.
Okay, amazing. I guess it would help us then define, who are achieving on these quality metrics, so that we understand what are the good, separating out the wheat from the chaff, as it were, in terms of organizations that are available. Can I submit my response but not have it published? And you mentioned that all the answer or all the responses were going to be published. Is there a way for people to be kept out of that, or how are we treating that?
So all of the responses will be published anonymously, or not all of the responses. We will collate and analyze feedback, and we'll provide a summary of that, but we will not be sharing unless you specifically want us to, and you're very welcome to highlight that on your submission. But as a standard, everything will be anonymized.
Okay, perfect. I guess this was kind of talked about a little bit before, but why are we focusing on quality? Like, isn't cost and speed more important to people? Jim, you mentioned about it costing 40K a day to run a trial. Don't I care more about that metric as opposed to the quality metric? Why are we focusing on this?
This is an interesting question. Well, because if you think about it, you really have to balance all three, right? If you go really, really fast, but the quality of the data is no good at the end, you just wasted however much money you spent on that study because the data is irrelevant, right? So speed is important, but what's more important is what you get at the end. Now, the cost is an interesting question too, because somehow as a sponsor, you have to balance the amount of money you can spend to get the data that you need to have a business case to bring that product to market. So cost is important, speed is important, quality is important, and all three of them kind of have to balance against one another. And again, the reason we're focusing on quality here is because there's been so much work done already on speed in terms of measuring it. speed, and cost. I mean, it's easy to measure costs. It's how much money did you spend? You just got to have a good accountant to keep track of it.
Yeah.
The speed part gets a little tricky sometimes, but like I said, there's been a lot of work done in the industry over the last 2 or 3 decades to define some metrics that allow us to measure, milestones within the course of a clinical study. So yeah, speed's important, but it's not the only thing that's important. So is cost, and so is quality.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to attempt to interpret this question because it said, and I think it was when we were talking about how the MCRC model is well known, but maybe not perceived as high quality or might be potentially costly. The question is, did this align or differentiate with the type of AMCs? I wonder if that is meant to say MCRCs there, because we were using AMCs as academic medical centers in this context. Because then the question then goes on to say, whether traditional SMO, privately owned clinics, or broader AMCs, again, I believe that's MCRCs, whether sites are still independent clinical practices, ? Can you just say a little bit about where the linking leaders data came from, what that was in relation to?
Yes, the linking leaders data was nothing to do with us. That was a 2024 survey that they did, and they found the perception of MCRCs. Sorry, too many acronyms of MCRCs.
I know, it's awful.
At the time was that consultation added to operational complexity and costs. Now, the point around MCRCs, and I think potentially what's being asked here is whether we define. So when we did our own research with the survey with SBM Research that went out via clinical leaders, was how we defined site types within that. So we didn't define specific types of networks. We bundled all the networks into MCRCs, and we gave them the definition that the AMRC has. So that's anybody with more than 5 sites. And then we asked about
whether they're integrated or affiliated, we were bundling them as the MCRC model, for example.
Yes, and then we asked about independent separately and academic or medical institutes, and there were a couple of other site types which I'm afraid I can't remember off the top of my head. But in the white paper, we have the full methodology there.
Okay, perfect.
We should point out, Katie, just a quick comment. Yeah. We should point out that MCRCs, as we define them, are corporations where the ownership lies within that corporation, and it's not a loose affiliation of sites where each of those sites are owned by their own businesses. So just in case anyone's wondering about that, SMOs, the term SMO sometimes has a connotation of what it was 20, 30 years ago, where they were unsuccessful. This is not the same. So just to point that out for people.
Yeah, and if people watch this space, there might be something coming from AMRC on exactly the taxonomy of sites, but I don't want to get everyone too excited this side of Christmas. The last one's not a question, but sort of an affirmation of what we were saying earlier. So thank you for saying this, but when talking about, why would non-AMRC members contribute to or submit something for the consultation, they've said non-AMRC sites will still benefit by AMRC's advancements, rising tides raise all ships concept. So thank you for backing us up, and we didn't even have to pay you to say it. So that's great. So that brings us to a close. We've been through all of your questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight and clarity on both the white paper and the consultation. As a reminder, the consultation deadline is December 3rd. Please email the info@amrc.org email if you have any questions and want our help with anything. Jim and Emma, thank you so much for your time. And I think we're done. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Emma.